All right, so in this lecture, I want to finish talking about moral luck. Um, Basically, I just want to ask, how do we respond to moral luck, to this whole phenomenon? Um, One sort of reaction is just to discard the control condition, to just say that, okay, you know what? We're going to get rid of this. Um, and I'll be honest, to my mind, moral luck is a better argument for compatibilism than are any metaphysical considerations, like the nature of time or whatever. So why do I say this? Well, because if you get rid of the control condition, then I think this does land you with compatibilism, right? Remember both the libertarian and the determinist agreed that the ability to do otherwise is a condition of responsibility. And I think for both the libertarian about free will and the determinist, this goes back to the control condition. Both the determinist and the libertarian agree that we need control to be responsible. They just differ on whether we have it or not. The libertarian thinks we never do, the libertarian thinks that we usually do. In normal circumstances, we have it, whereas the determinist thinks no, we never have it. So if we just get rid of the control condition, if we say, you know what, we can hold people responsible whether they have this deep sense of control over their actions or not, then I think we end up with compatibilism, right? And moral luck, is a pretty good argument, or at least it seems a pretty good argument for getting rid of the control condition. Some philosophers will even say, oh, if we look closely enough at moral luck, we see that we don't even actually believe the control condition. There's some philosophers who do what's called experimental philosophy, and basically this is just, you poll people what they think about these issues, right? It's, philosophy by Gallup poll, right? We'll leave aside some worries about, well, just how accurate are polls. They don't seem to be super accurate these days. But, these philosophers will say, well, if you ask people the right questions, they respond in a way that shows they don't believe the control condition. I'm super skeptical about that because one of the reasons we should sometimes worry about polls as well, you can really change the response a lot. Just based on how you ask the questions and what options you give people. Back in the day, I remember seeing that support for the death penalty would vary by, I think, something like 10 or 15 points, just based on whether you gave people an option for life in prison without the possibility of parole, right? Other ways of posing it will make the numbers move quite a bit. You see this on a lot of questions. So I'm skeptical. But more deeply than that, I think just the issue is we're just inconsistent, right? Sometimes we respond to certain cases in ways that pretty clearly don't fit with the control condition, treating the two drunk drivers differently. That is not consistent with the control condition. But I think, usually when I ask my classes, I haven't done the poll with you guys, but, when I present the control condition, I'm like, do you believe this? Is it true? Every hand, maybe not every hand, right? I feel like in every class couldn't get every hand for anything, right? But most hands go up. And, when you think about these intuitive cases, it certainly seems like the control condition explains them. Like why we do hold people responsible for being lazy, but we don't hold them responsible, for a disease they might have. Anyway, but I think we're just inconsistent. You could say, look, let's just be consistent As it is, sometimes we think the control condition's necessary. A lot of other cases, we obviously don't act like it's necessary. Let's just be consistent and get rid of it. Let's just say responsibility does not require control in the sense of this control condition. All that matters for responsibility, as the compatibilist will say, is that your actions are linked to your character or the type of person you are in the right way. That is like maybe a thinner sense of control, but that's all you really need. All you need is the link between what kind of person you are and your actions. And now look, I think this can explain some things, right? It explains why we don't punish the insane. It explains, again, why we don't hold people responsible for actions that are caused by diseases or accidents, right? Not linked to their character in the right way. So it's not a crazy position. But I think there is still something very deeply unsatisfying about this. Compatibilists would say all that matters are that your actions are linked to your character in the right way, the normal way. Compatibilists kind of wave their hands on this, but if you really press them, they have to say it does not matter how you become the type of person you are. Consistent compatibilists, what they need to say is matters that your actions are linked to your character, the type of person you are in the right way. It does not matter how you become the type of person you are. Do you buy that, though? Look, we do lessen our blame of someone if we can show that their bad character or bad features of their personality are due to factors outside their control. We might not let them off. We might not entirely excuse their bad character or, the actions that stem from it, but we will lessen it, right? On the one hand, if you find out some historical figure you really admired had some racist attitudes, people say this about Lincoln a lot. On the one hand, it's the 1860s. There's some moral luck there. On the other, even if that's true, you probably step away from that admiring Lincoln a little less, right? On the other hand, though, when it comes to full-on blame, we do lessen it when we see that the bad features of someone's character are due to factors outside of their control, right? A murderer who had an awful childhood, right? A lot of times you'll see this during sentencing. Somebody's been convicted of murder, and either to try to spare them the death penalty or to get a lighter sentence, the defense will bring up what a terrible childhood this person had, right? And if the person really did have a terrible childhood, if they suffered awful neglect and abuse, a lot of times we will think, okay, that partially excuses this person's actions. Sometimes this is successful in getting people spared the death penalty or a lighter sentence, but even more than that, I think most of us, when we hear that, will say, okay, there's more of an excuse for this person being a terrible person, having terrible character. Compare this, not that this guy committed murder, but compare this with, the Stanford swimmer, Brock Turner, right? Not only is he a terrible person, he had a middle-class, privileged upbringing. His parents treated him just fine. You find that out and you say, okay, we're pretty sure Brock has a lot more character a lot more control over the fact he has terrible character and is a terrible person than is someone who had an awful childhood, right? We will hold someone who has not faced disadvantages, has not faced abuse or neglect or other things that might warp your character. We will blame them or be more inclined to fully blame them than someone who does have the excuse of, I faced abuse, I faced neglect. This is what warped my character, right? So, you know, there definitely seems to be something that would be very uncomfortable, you know, in accepting this, right? To say that it doesn't matter if you have a privileged middle class childhood and nonetheless still end up an awful person versus you have faced all this abuse and neglect you can't control. The compatibilists will say, yeah, let's treat those people the same. I think most of us are not comfortable with that. I certainly am not comfortable with that. Or again, you know, racist relatives and acquaintances of a certain age, right? I mean, it's getting to the point that no one has an excuse for this anymore. But, I mean, I don't think we'd entirely excuse it. But if someone has not great attitudes about race and we find, we think, okay, I was a boy in the 90s, you talk to a 70-year-old, in the 90s, somebody born in the 20s. When I was even younger in the 80s, you talk to someone born in the 19 teens. You do excuse this, maybe not excuse it, but you do lessen the blame in a way that you wouldn't, I think for most of us, with someone who was, say, 20 or 30, right? They interview the white supremacist on TV, the young educated one. There's no excuse. We blame this person. Nothing excuses that behavior. With an older person, we probably do think there's more of an excuse. All right. We'll not get into the philosophical question of whether it's okay to punch a Nazi. I will say the most famous Nazi that's been punched on camera, I had the misfortune of meeting this guy before he became a Nazi. Even before he was a Nazi, most people had a strong urge to punch him. Not that that makes it okay to punch him. Anyway, I'm getting off the point. Finally, a vice that a person has that's clearly due to something outside their control, right? I have known people who are distrustful and prickly and paranoid because they have been through absolute hell at work, right? You look at their work environment, you look at the career they've chosen, and you think, oh my goodness, I'm so glad I have not been through this. If I had to put up with this sort of work environment for years, the career field this person has, I would probably have some of these traits too, right? And again, it's hard not to think less of a person to a certain degree for having these traits. It's maybe not super pleasant to be around them, right? But if you hear a story, it's like, okay, this is what happened to them. They got gaslighted at work. Their boss did this terrible thing to them. They put up with this for years. You might think, okay, it's not good to be paranoid. It's not good to be prickly, but, at least for this person, I'll excuse it a bit. Is it really their fault? Look, I don't know, right? All of this is probably, you're thinking he's rambling, this might be a bit vague. The problem is, I just think there's a deep contradiction here, right? Or a deep tension in the way we think about this stuff, right? A consistent compatibilist for all of these would just have to say, doesn't matter, right? You know, you treat the murderer who had an awful, awful childhood where he was locked in the closet, beaten terribly, the same as the one who had the stable middle class existence. You know, we blame someone who picked up racist attitudes in the 20s just as much and no less than someone who was born in the 80s and has no good excuse for this. Just treat them the same, you know. If their character's the same, if they have the same issues, that's all that matters if their actions are linked to that character. You know, the prickly paranoid person who's just a jerk is no different than the one who has, become prickly and paranoid because of terrible work environments. Doesn't matter. That's what a consistent compatibilist would have to say. I'm not ready to say that. And I'm going to doubt that you are, right? If you can't just shrug your shoulders and say, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how you became the kind of person who would kill people, just matters that you are. Doesn't matter how you came to have racist or sexist attitudes, just matters that you did. Doesn't matter how you came to be prickly and paranoid, just matters that you are, right? If you're not willing to say that, you're not a consistent compatibilist. If you are, okay, yeah, you're a compatibilist, but I think it's harder to be a consistent one than people realize. But I think being consistent at all here is really difficult. Think about what it would mean to be consistent about being a libertarian and maintaining the control condition. We would have to treat, again, there might be differences. Philosophers' little neat examples, we can make things exactly the same. In the real world, it's not like that. But we would have to treat the drunk driver who doesn't kill anybody the same as we treat the one who does, right? That would mean either incredibly strict sentences for people who just drive drunk. You say, okay, you could have killed someone, you didn't, we're still going to treat you as though you've committed manslaughter and throw you in jail, right? Or it would mean much lighter sentences for the drunk drivers who do kill people, right? Or maybe we meet somewhere in the middle. And again, I don't think a consistent libertarian could deny this, right? Libertarian says, well, we're only responsible ultimately for what we have control over. And it's like, well, okay. If what we're holding people responsible for is what they choose, then the drunk driver who kills someone and the one who doesn't have chosen the same thing, to drive drunk. The person who, carelessly target practices and doesn't hurt anybody has chosen to do the same thing as someone who puts a bullet through someone's window, as someone who kills someone, right? If choice is what matters, we would have to, it seems consistency would say, treat these people the same. I don't know that we're ready to do that either. To me, and there's the deeper question here. Libertarian says, okay, we're only responsible for what we choose. Well, even if you think that choice makes some contribution to our character, to our actions, the question is how much? How could you ever tell how much? I don't know. The philosophical lesson here is it's just really hard to be consistent. And I don't know what consistency would look like. The practical lesson here, and this is maybe one we should dwell on more, is that we ought to seriously ask ourselves how much of our good behavior or avoiding bad behavior or avoiding terrible results is just due to luck. Luck in when we were born, luck in the choices we face, luck that our careless, stupid actions have not had the worst possible effects they could, right? How many of us have glanced at a radio while driving somewhere where there could be people walking out in the street? How many of us have carelessly left a stove eye on? How many of us have driven way too fast through a neighborhood where people might walk out in the street? Again, ask yourself these questions, and you are going to get some uncomfortable answers, I think, right? So there's a practical lesson here. I think maybe it is that we should be a little harder on ourselves with these moral questions because probably a lot of our own good behavior or avoiding bad behavior or avoiding bad results has been due to luck. We should maybe strive, or probably strive, to be a bit easier on others because when it comes to others, we probably don't see the degree that what they have done and what's happened to them has been due to luck. Okay, so next lecture I want to talk about Sartre's views on freedom. We'll see he has a really radical view on all this. I'm going to give Sartre a pretty hard time. I'm going to be pretty critical, but I do think there are some important insights here.